This video is a little bit longer than normal. It's about 40 minutes and it's an edited version of a presentation that I did in the last few weeks at Art First Gallery in London. The presentation looks at close to 40 years of personal work. I follow a sequential route through various bodies of work in order to explain my motivations and how I've approached the documentation of South Africa's complex past. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about various bodies of work, but I'll begin with just giving you a kind of background of how I started in photography. Some photographers find a theme very early on in their careers and then stick with it. If you think of people like Cindy Sherman, they find a subject and then they create a visual language and they're able to kind of hold that throughout their career. But coming from South Africa, things were moving so fast and you couldn't really hold a particular look for the whole time because change was forcing the way that one needed to react to things. Apartheid was a bit like having a dark cloud on the horizon almost permanently. And for black people, it was like being in a black fog on a daily basis. People who grew up in, say, Devon or Provence or Ohio can kind of slowly work their theme, but I always was drawn to doing long essays, initially in a very strongly documentary style. I'm not talking about these initial pictures so this is just to get you into the vibe, as they say. So while I was doing these longer essays, I realized that a lot of events were happening in South Africa at a very fast pace. So I eventually decided I would throw myself into the photojournalistic side of the photographing. One day in Cape Town, I heard that there was some fighting in a township called Khayelitsha. And I was completely naive. I had no idea what photojournalists were meant to do. So I just drove into this battleground. I stopped in this area and it was like a scene out of Braveheart, where two opposing forces were fighting with axes and kind of shields and makeshift spears. I can't remember a kind of moment of that time. I just threw myself into it and photographed. And then that evening, the local paper, the Argus, ran my photographs. When I was watching television, I heard that a BBC cameraman, George Diath, had been hacked to death very close to where I'd been working. One would think I would have felt a little bit sort of deterred, but at that stage, I was dumb enough to think that it was a reasonable career. In the 80s, I was living with my wife Frances in London, and we went to the Nelson Mandela 70th birthday concert at Wembley Stadium, which was a fantastic event, but one could almost feel that things were changing and there was a sense that the South African government was working towards letting Mandela go and getting rid of the old order. I really wanted to be closer to the action and to feel that I was part of the transition to a new South Africa. I'm just going to let this first section finish before I move on. So this is the beginning of my news period where I had moved to Johannesburg, and I naively thought, okay, well, I'll just go into the Reuters office in Johannesburg and tell them that I'm a news photographer. The unfortunate thing was I had no hard news within my portfolio. The most cutting edge tear sheet that I had was something I'd done for Cosmopolitan magazine when Andy and Fergie went to Mauritius. So that was... But luckily there was a war happening at the north of Namibia on the border with Angola. The star photographers really wanted to go cover it. And even though they could see that I wasn't a very proficient news photographer, they thought, okay, well, you know, what damage can I really do? Because there wasn't much going on in Johannesburg at that time. The first few days were really fine, and then the bureau chief wandered over to me and said, oh, there's sort of some fighting going on in a township called Tukoza, which I had no clue where it was or what it was. And I drove down the highway sort of thinking, okay, this is what I signed up for. I found the township, and then I just asked sundry people, where's the fighting? And anyway, eventually I found burning shacks and people running around like crazy. And I parked my little yellow City Golf, and I just thought, well, you know, if I'm going to do this, I've got to get out of the car and do what Robert Capa says, which is, if your pictures aren't good enough, then you're not close enough. It was a real baptism of fire. That evening I sent some photographs, and they were perfectly fine for the job. And the news desk in London said, well, I don't think many people are going to be interested in this once-off news story of violence. But the thing is, the violence carried on. And by the end of that week, the death toll was reaching 50 a day. And that's all they wanted from then on, was violence from South Africa. You know, this was a real hard initiation into what the life of a photojournalist really is. And for the next 5 years, this is what I did. And it would be waking up, listening to the radio, hearing where the violence was, and wandering off to do photographs. It was a particularly strange way of living, because one would go off and see this violence in the townships, but when you came back to the suburbs, life was carrying on in a very normal way that's not dissimilar to London or anywhere else. The violence was kept to small areas, normally on the edges of townships. In 1994, I'd had 5 years of this work, and when Mandela was inaugurated, I decided not to go, and I handed in my pager, pre-cell phone days, and I watched the event on television. Because I'd never really wanted to be a conflict photographer, and I certainly didn't want to travel around the world covering stories in other people's backyards. I felt this was a particularly poignant period in South Africa, and it was my country, and I was documenting what I believed was an amazing part of history. After the initial period of stopping news, I felt a sort of freedom, but I also felt untethered, because apartheid was such a strong overriding theme that once it had gone, one felt what was the purpose of really being a photographer. For a number of years, I kind of stumbled around in the dark. What I finally realized is that I could photograph what was happening within me in relation to what was happening to South Africa. The Inner City was published in 2000, but the photographs happened for 3 or 4 years beforehand. It's called The Inner City because it's within Johannesburg inner city. What I wanted to do was explore my inner world through an external subject. During this time, black people were moving into the city and white people were fleeing to the suburb. It was this weird standoff between the races because no one knew who was who within the new hierarchy. There was a sort of general sense of isolation and fear. And at that stage, those were two emotions that I really could feel, because during the 5 years that I'd done news, my sense of what was normal shifted to something that was very abnormal. I could only really relate to life when I was in an adrenaline, high-pressure state. It's a strange process. I can't say it happened on any particular day or period. It just seemed slowly my sense of what was real shifted into another place. It could have been the extended time of being in fear and adrenaline, or it could have been a few sort of real life or death situations which might have also shifted it. When I was covering an attempted coup in Bophuthatswana, a far right-wing person from the AWB, it was called, put a shotgun in my mouth. I'd seen them kill 4 or 5 people earlier. Luckily, one of his colleagues walked past and said, "Beat them up, don't shoot them," which was a big relief. And it was strange. I mean, it was only a week later that I was in a place called Zululand doing something else, another story. And while I was driving back, I hit a kind of brick wall, psychically and physically. And the only thing I remember, just driving into a hotel and sleeping for 24 hours or 30 hours. That addiction to stress made me feel an isolation so I couldn't relate to normal life and I couldn't relate to normal interactions. In this body of work, I wanted to show that feeling. How I'd go about it was getting in touch with that feeling within myself and then going out and shooting, trying to find images that mirrored that feeling. At this stage, my creative path was again linked in an indirect way to the transformation within the country. And I was learning the craft of expressing an internal feeling through the external. At this stage during the presentation, my camera switched off, so I'll redo this part of the presentation. This next project involved a big shift in seeing as well as in my choice of visual language. The term visual language refers to the look of the photographs. Style is considered to be a somewhat grubby word when discussing any form of creativity. In order to craft a long-term project, one needs to maintain a feel or a look so that viewers can tie the individual images to the broader body of work. Visual language for me has evolved into a tool that allows me to circle a new subject matter and approach it from a different perspective. You can see that superficially this series is very different from the previous one, The Inner City. But what remains consistent is that I'm the one looking and photographing. It was 2002 and there was still optimism that Mandela's dream for the country could be realized. The honeymoon phase was, however, over and cracks had started to show. Corruption was becoming more overt, and there was anger that the new democratic government had continued to sideline the majority of the population. President Mbeki was becoming more vocal about his AIDS denialism, and it's estimated that his policies led to the deaths of between 300 and 400,000 people. I chose to focus on the marginalized within society, those that had been forced due to economic circumstances to inhabit the edges of communities. They were on the literal and figurative edges of town. I wanted to use strong abstracted color to emphasize the fragmented nature of their lives, and dense shadows to evoke a sense of danger. These people often feared assault as well as hunger, and over 4 years I traveled to more than 100 towns throughout South Africa. My hit rate for achieving images that I wanted was extremely low, mainly because I had developed a template that required that a number of fundamental factors come together. You can see in these images that there are 2 or 3 points of focus. So rather than creating a central decisive moment or focal point, I wanted the viewer's attention to be unsettled, shifting between various points of activity within the frame. The purpose of this was to create a tension and a sense of unease that reflected the subject's edgy existence. To create dynamic and unexpected compositions, I avoided my usual approach of observing and photographing subjects from an objective standpoint. I had to hold back on fixing any idea in my mind of what type of photograph I wanted, until I was physically close to the subjects. So the photographs are made in what would normally be regarded as someone else's personal space. In normal life, I'm probably overconscious of my and other people's space. So this was a very conscious decision to break through my natural reserve. Working so close to my subjects allowed the elements of chance and spontaneity to enter the frame, which again adds to the tension. Age definitely impacts on how and what you focus on as a photographer. I became less interested in current events and was drawn to more subtle aspects of communicating. I'm not sure if it's the same for all photographers, but I was becoming more contemplative about my work and turning my attention to the photographic process itself. During my travels around South Africa, I had noticed that even within the poorest, most deprived communities, there were some people who managed to rise above the appalling circumstances in which they found themselves. From my vantage point in the leafy suburbs, it seemed impossible to imagine that a flicker of hope or the desire for dignity could survive within these spaces. In amongst a sprawl of grey, rusting shacks, I would sometimes come across someone who refused to sink into the mire. A brightly coloured wall or a polished stoop would appear within this bleak landscape, and I could feel that my response to these kind of unicorn moments was always uplifting. This project was photographed over a number of years, and in a way I was holding onto my own flickering hope that the country could still pull itself out of the downward spiral that it was in. In a way, I was straining to extract the last traces of color and optimism from the path that I shared with my country. My goal was to draw viewers' attention by providing strong abstracted colors. These elements act almost as trinkets that initially distract the viewer's attention from their surroundings. After their eye settles, they can then explore the greater context in a less harsh manner. In 2013, I won the Ernest Cole Award, which allowed me to pursue a follow-up project within the inner city of Johannesburg. Over the short period of 12 years since the inner city was published, the population demographics of the area changed dramatically, and almost no white people remained. Johannesburg had begun as a mining settlement, then grew into a city, and post-1994, it became a nexus for Africans seeking a better life. The population of the inner city had exploded, but very little had been done to update housing conditions. In this essay, I wanted to avoid producing photographs that could be described as poverty porn. I guess that I was trying to shift away from anything that had a formal documentary or linear narrative feel. In a way, I was evading the reality of what the country had become. I wanted to see if it was possible to again use abstracted color fragments in order to create a lyrical poem that would inform without overt scrutiny. So by incorporating movement and shapes and color, I attempted to build an oblique portrait of the city. The 2014 national elections marked the first occasion in which voters born in the democratic South Africa were able to vote. This group of young voters were nicknamed Born Frees, after the song and film Born Free. This generation of youth was the first to be born free of apartheid, but that freedom was hollow without opportunities to exercise these freedoms. 2/3 of the country's youth are now unemployed, and this economic situation can be blamed on the country's past, but also on chronic corruption and mismanagement of the present ruling party. Having allowed myself to shift photographically further and further away from the traditional approach to documentary, I felt that in order to respond to these dire social realities, I had to return to what I described as straight photography. In the same way that apartheid demanded a clear response, I had to document these jarring realities head-on. I traveled around the country and spoke to and photographed youngsters who had just left school but lacked the means to pursue their dreams. They might have done well in matric, but because their families were barely surviving, they had to settle for menial jobs, if they were lucky enough to find them, while others grew frustrated and despondent and turned to gangs, crime and drugs. I would ask them what they would like to be if money wasn't an issue, and they all had very clear visions of what their futures could be like. I wanted to capture their hopes and their bravery, but also the recognition that there was little chance of them achieving their ambitions. I've included this section for a bit of light relief. During 2 consecutive Christmas holidays at a coastal village called Pringle Bay, I came across 2 remarkable dogs, Connie and Roxy. They were twins and were a mix between Weimaraner and Border Collie. They would get up every morning, have breakfast, and then just run over the dunes and spend the rest of the day doing dog stuff. They were incredibly bright and seemed to be perfectly attuned. They would even work together in a coordinated way to catch fish. The dogs would interact with me for a brief period and then get bored and race off to do some other dog adventure. So I had to just kind of hang around and get their attention. The owner of the dogs contacted me a decade later to say that the dogs lived to the age of 19 and they died within 3 months of each other. Their ashes are scattered over the beach where they spent their holidays. After 30 years living in Johannesburg, my wife and I recently moved to a small village 2 hours drive north of Cape Town. My focus has again shifted away from direct truth-telling. I'm photographing the communities on the west coast of South Africa. It's an underpopulated area between the sea and the semi-desert interior. I think that my point of departure for approaching the subject comes from a place of acceptance. Acceptance that the country seems to be on an unstoppable downward spiral. Acceptance that I can disengage from being bound to the country's socio-political roller coaster. And also that I can photograph without attempting to attach meaning. Perhaps along my broad photographic path, this is just another temporary diversion. But for now, I'm drawn to photograph what I see without trying to extract or impose a deeper significance. Photographers like William Eggleston and Stephen Shaw pioneered this approach of disinterested vernacular photography in the 60s and in the 70s. It was revolutionary at the time because art photography was dominated by people like Ansel Adams and Richard Avedon, who took well-composed images of beautiful landscapes and people. South African photography has been so intertwined with apartheid and social upheaval forever, so it almost feels like this is an act of rebellion for me to put those themes aside. These images explore textures, juxtapositions, color for color's sake, and if they do communicate meaning, I'm hoping that it's due to their innate value. Thanks to all of you that stuck around till the end, and great, I'll see you next time. Cheers.